So hello and welcome everyone. Welcome to this Demos event with UCL Policy Lab and Lloyds Bank Foundation, in which we're asking how can we put civil society at the heart of public service reform. And I've just been doing a little round of the audience here, and we have got so many brilliant kind of audience members with expertise in this as well. So I'm really looking forward to the Q&A bit of this. The format for this is we are going to, each of my brilliant panellists here are going to give some opening thoughts on this subject. We're going to have a bit of a conversation, open that up, and then bring in your contributions as well from the audience. And as I say, there are so many amazing voluntary organisations and individuals in the room, very keen to hear from you. So I'm going to start by introducing our brilliant panellists. Matt Hyde is CEO of Lloyds Bank Foundation. Gregory Stafford is MP for Farnham and Boreham.
Farnham and Boreham.
Do you know what? I've written it down so badly here.
I know
Apologies. Thank you very much. Olivia Field is Head of Policy at the British Red Cross. And Lauren Andres is Pro Vice Chancellor for Inequalities at Provost. Yeah, sorry, doing really well here. For Inequalities at University College London. So you can see we've got a range of experience on this subject on the panel. And we at Demos are partnering at the moment with UCL Policy Lab and Lloyds Bank Foundation to think about how we create a stronger narrative and a movement around the role for civil society in public service reform. Our starting point is that the national renewal that this country needs at the moment is going to take so much more than government, so much more than civil society, citizens, business. We need a kind of collective effort. So how do we tell the story and build the movement to deliver on that? But I'm going to start with Matt Hyde and ask you to kind of have your best shot in 2 minutes at the question, how do we put civil society at the heart of public service reform?
Oh, thanks, Polly. Great to be here and great to see some familiar faces in the audience as well. Let me start just by saying that, as Polly said, we've been working with Demos and UCL Policy Lab really to think through how do you ensure a significant renewal in the country. And it starts from the premise that we tend to rely on thinking about the state of the market, and we often overlook the power of civil society. And that is critical if we're to unlock our greatest asset as a country, which is our people and our communities. So at Lloyds Bank Foundation for 40 years, we have funded about 45,000 community organisations and charities. We've invested about £1 billion thanks to the generosity of Lloyds Banking Group over that period. And what I've seen on my travels, I've been doing this job a year now, is that as you go around the country, most of the organisations we fund are small local community organisations and charities. And they, as many of you will know, have been facing the challenges of fewer donors, fewer volunteers, and increased demand on their services. And you could get quite despondent going around hearing that story multiple times, but actually I feel this huge sense of optimism and positivity if we can get behind that strength of the country. But we've got to be realistic. We have to do things differently. And that means you've got to rethink how procurement works, how commissioning works, to ensure that charities and the voluntary and community sector are not seen as an afterthought. But when you're developing public services, that right at the start, civil society is at the heart of those deliberations, where you're genuinely putting people in the lead. And here we are at the Conservative Party conference. This draws on a kind of Burkean philosophy that's been, hardwired into the thinking of the Conservative Party about how you need to invest in communities. Obviously, we have the big society. And the challenge there wasn't really good thinking behind that, but there wasn't necessarily the plan that went with it, and critically, funding did not flow, and it got associated with austerity. And if you're really going to pull this off, you need to think about new funding flows, how you unlock philanthropy, and how you unlock a multiplier effect. So when the state puts money in, you crowd in funding from different sources as well. Maybe we can get into that a bit more.
Definitely, I know there's expertise in the audience on that specifically as well. Gregory, what's your take?
Well, thank you very much. I mean, I've said it before, I think at an event similar to this last year, but often people see charity as the failure of the state, when in fact it's actually an enhancement to it, and in many cases can do things that the state neither can nor indeed should. Charity, the civil society, in my view, understands the customer far better than the state does. It knows what is needed, it knows the solutions, and it knows the situation within which it operates far more closely than the state does, especially at a local level. Now, those of you who are not Conservatives in the room may disagree with this, but I genuinely believe that the Conservative Party is the party of charity and the civil society. That's not unique, it's not a unique feature of the Conservative Party, but it is embedded in it. If you speak to any Conservative Party member, I'm not going to ask you now, but every Conservative Party member will be doing some kind of voluntary work. They may not even realise it is voluntary or charitable work, it's just the thing they do. From a bake sale at their local church, to helping out with the local scouts, to coaching a mini football team at the weekends, these are the things that Conservative Party members are doing, and I think that's very much within our ethos going forward. I think if any good, and there wasn't much good, I can say, that came out of COVID, was at the time a real sense of national cohesiveness to deal with the issue, but more especially a sense of people wanting to help each other. And we saw local organisations, those that are already established, but also those that formed during that time to try and help and get over that terrible time. I feel we've slightly lost that since then, and I think what we need to do is try and recapture, without the dreadful nature of a pandemic, but recapture that same social cohesion, that same belief that we can do things and change things and help people at a local level again. And you touched on some of the challenges that organisations have: money, resources, volunteers. What I've found in my time as a Member of Parliament is that if you can make it personal, if you can make it local, people are much more willing to volunteer or to donate to those charities. And that's nothing against the large charities out there. They have an absolutely amazing piece of work to do. But I think people like to be able to see visibly and demonstrably a change happening with their volunteering time or their money. So again, I think for both, that is where I'm positive and help, and I think we've got a great potential there, is if we can make it local, I think then we really have a way to go. You also touched on the big society, an idea which I'm fully behind, not so keen on the name, I have to say, but I think it's something that we really should push more going forward. Because returning to where I started, we all know what financial straits this country is in at the moment, and we are not going to be able to solve them, and the public aren't going to put up with us solving them by simply levying more tax on ordinary people. What we've got to do is have a reset and get those people who can spend money more wisely, more locally, and more effectively to get that money and to be putting it out in society. And I think that's the only way we're going to get out of the issues that we face.
Brilliant, thank you. Big society has already come up twice, and that is a theme I want to come back to, so I'll bank that for now. But Olivia.
Right, so my role at the British Red Cross is head of policy. So it's to translate what we're seeing on the ground through our UK services into policy and practice solutions. So the problems that we're seeing and the solutions that we're seeing. And that includes drawing on our work in local communities, helping people with health and care needs, responding to emergencies on average 3 times a day. And these experiences give us strategic insights rooted in real human need. And those insights have the potential to improve lives, improve services, and also improve the economy. So one example that I've been asked to speak about today is our work on loneliness. I sat on the Joe Cox Commission on Loneliness. I then set up the Loneliness Action Group and later joined the cross-government Tackling Loneliness team to represent the voluntary sector. And together we placed loneliness on the political agenda. We shone a spotlight on an issue that the state and institutions had largely missed. And then we worked together really collaboratively to pull together a cross-government strategy and secure millions of pounds for the issue on the ground. And it was a uniquely strong partnership across sectors, built on trust, built on ambition and political will. But if I'm really honest, that kind of collaboration is still the exception. It's often really difficult for civil society to work with government as strategic partners. And that's despite the huge potential we have to truly transform public services. So that experience, as well as a few others, working on great partnerships on hospital discharge, on reducing the high intensity use of A&E, and on emergency preparedness, I've really learned three things. That first, civil society keeps people at the heart of public service reform. We're often the first to see unmet need, and we're often the last to leave. The second is we often deliver better outcomes and better value for money. We're really strong innovators, and we're great at prevention and building resilience. And the third is that we're more than service providers. When given the chance, we're great co-creators of policy and practice. So I often imagine what the world would be like if my team and our partners around the room could work with government in the way that we once worked on loneliness with them. And it would be a much better place. So that's the shift that we really need to see today.
I'd love to come back to some of those themes of what that better partnership would look like. Thank you, Olivia. Lauren.
Thank you, Bonnie, and thank you again for inviting me today. I'm from UCL. I'm here with the head of Provides Poverty Inequalities, but especially as a researcher, we conducted large-scale projects funded by the ESRC during the pandemic and after the pandemic. And I think here what I'm going to say resonates a lot with what we just heard from Matt and Gregory especially. What we saw during the pandemic is not only a trauma, but also extremely positive lessons on how grassroots initiatives really allowed communities to be resilient and really to get together. And what we saw during this time and in the work we did in Birmingham, in Brighton and London is community groups, faith groups, teachers, youth groups really getting together. What is happening currently is really a situation where there's a bit of fatigue, and there's really a demand from those organizations to be heard and to move forward in a context, as Matt was saying, where there's really not a lot of agility in the current business approach to helping and supporting charities, and also where they are facing a very rigid, compliance-heavy system in order to get the grants. What is really interesting and what it means currently when we're reflecting on where do we stand in terms of really addressing inequalities, but also providing for key needs like access to food, access to health, access to social care. What is very clear here is that place matters. Knowledge and trust is really constructed locally. It is constructed in communities, and those communities are basically the ones holding, in a way, people together. And this is really important if we want to think about the big society and what it comes next, if we want to think about what devolution can mean. And in relation to this, we really need to rethink trust in relation to what happened to the pandemic, and how can trust be at the forefront of constructing new form of governance, governance of care, governance of really provision again to key services. And what we've been seeing in different cities is really communities getting together, building, for example, community centers, where not only they provide access to play, to education, to food, to social care, but they manage really to do this in the same place by sharing the cost, by having a very efficient approach to how they manage grants, and effectively to be able to be very inclusive towards the one who really need help and really need support. And I think there's a lot really to learn out of what happened in this period of the pandemic, but also post-pandemic, the cost of living crisis, to really build on this and scale up, and really start by empowering those groups who are at the forefront really of building this knowledge and this trust at local level. And there's really scope to start to think about how can we engage with sort of test and learn approach, where we can really learn from those experiences that have been built during the pandemic, and how can we scale this up to really put the civil society at the forefront, but really to think about new form of governance mechanism, trust mechanism, funding mechanism that will very much challenge how places are functioning, and also how people and communities are coping and basically becoming much more resilient.
Thank you so much for that. I wanted to come back just with a quick practical question, Lauren, because sometimes the language of this around relational public services, around trust, around even kind of civil society can feel fluffy and soft. But I know you've done some work kind of evaluating the kind of the impact of this on efficiency and effectiveness. This is a better way of operating, not just a nicer one.
Absolutely. What we're seeing is, in a way, there's an issue of trust to, let's say, the higher levels, and especially after the pandemic. If we're looking at the most vulnerable communities, they don't really trust, and we're the government, I think we know this, but they do trust the organizations that will provide their support. So it's really a matter of building a sort of multi-level forms of trusting and people to trust each other, because that's really how it can work, and that here also how funding can channel from the top to the bottom. And I think it's really rebuilding the trust and building a new relationship between people in the field, people very much in their everyday life, and trying to recreate this relationship between local authorities and the national government.
Brilliant. Let's do some lessons learned, because a lot of this was tried in a big way with the big society. Kind of what worked, what didn't work. Gregory, you didn't like the name.
Well, yes, I mean, I didn't like the name, but because I thought it was a bit trite. But and I also don't think it really captured what was trying to be done. I think, as Matt said, there were clearly elements of it that were, or in terms of its ideas, I think were fantastic. I think it was where the implementation is where it fell down. The problem is, it's just what we've discussed. How do you, from a top-down perspective, implement a bottom-up system? You're trying to enforce localism, and that's an oxymoron in itself. And actually, I think where we need to start is with the organisations themselves at the local level. For what else is the state than a set of local organisations that over many centuries have built themselves up into something that's more formal? And actually, what we need to do is not start at the top, is to start at the bottom. It's to empower the local organisations that are already there, create the circumstances in which new organisations can flourish. And that might be to do through the tax system, that might be through the regulation of those charities, but that's the area to start at. Rather than reinventing the wheel or having some top-down diktat, it's about allowing local organisations to flourish.
Yeah, I really agree. The language we've been kind of using in this project is a nation of neighbours, so kind of really capitalising on those local networks. The challenge in that is the centre has to let go. And the centre feels quite accountable, it feels quite risk averse, and it has to kind of really change a lot of behaviours and habits. Do you think that's where big society most struggles?
Yes, I think you're right. The dead hand of the state always wants to control. It is massively risk averse. For someone who worked in healthcare before I became an MP and in the NHS, you see the risk, rightly in some ways, the risk averse nature of massive organisations. But I don't have a solution about how we do that, how we change that mentality. But I think unless we do so, I don't think we can go forward with this. What did you call it? A nation of neighbours. I love that. Actually, it's about, again, as I said, those individuals, those small organisations doing the things that they do, and a lot of it is, I think, could be done through, and God, I'm slowing myself down a path I may not want, but we're going through local government reorganisation, and charities have been coming to me, civil society has been coming to me during this and saying, nobody is talking about how we deal with the charity, how we deal with civil society and charitable. It's all about how we're going to deal with the structure and how we're going to deal with the things that the current or local authorities deal with. And actually, what we need to be doing is having a really honest conversation. Now, we've got an opportunity through restructuring to think about how do we empower local organisations.
Matt, do you want to pick up that point on how the centre changes to enable?
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about two things. So I was thinking about a health example and a youth example back to my kind of time when I was chief executive of the Scouts. And so one of the products of the Big Society was the National Citizen Service, NCS. We've got a lot to commend on that because what it was trying to do was at 16 create a rite of passage for everyone to do social action and volunteering. But it was the kind of, and I say this with the greatest respect to a lot of people I knew around, really decent people doing, who did a good job. But it was the perfect example of a very quite statist solution because it had a very rigid supply chain. You had to deliver the programme in a very specific way. Which meant that it was harder for the likes of, I can see the cadets here and the Scouts and others to participate. Now, I was talking to a chief medical officer, this is sort of pivoting to the sort of health example, who spent time in New Zealand where they were looking at neighbourhood health there. And he talked about the sort of phrasing he used was tight, loose, tight. So tight on what you're trying to achieve, loose on how you get there, loose on what the solutions are, and then tight on the measures of how you know whether you've achieved it or not. And I quite like that as a model. If you look at what's trying to, I don't think there's anyone really who disagrees that there needs to be a kind of shift from hospital to community. You know, with an ageing population, we've got to be honest with ourselves. The centre can't hold in the long run if we're all going to live older. When we built systems, public services, benefits that are kind of were developed in a time when we lived to like 60 or 65. And yet, you do see these real protectionist behaviours in that space around health, whereby the profession, the medical profession, for good reasons because of the risks involved, it's so difficult to let go and genuinely empower communities in that space and find commissioning. If I think about I went to a charity in Cardiff called Women's Connect First. Incredible organisation, loads of women, lots of different sort of support they were giving to refugees and asylum seekers there. What they were doing was health creation. They were doing skills development, and that was reducing demand onto the NHS. So unless you get funding flows shifting differently, all we'll be doing is keep putting money into a wage bill that ultimately will be unsustainable. So that requires completely different, it requires leadership and it requires culture change. And that's true of wherever you go. If you see that at a local level, you know, your Wigans, your Greater Manchesters, you start to see the lessons of what that could look like.
Olivia, you touched on some of this in terms of the incentives and commissioning and the partnership model. What would that perfect partnership model look like?
In terms of the Big Society, well, it would definitely be a recognition that charities, whether big or small, they are more than a delivery mechanism. They do have really important insights to help kind of shape what services, what systems, policy looks like. And we've spoken a lot here about kind of trust and how you build that at a local level. And yes, that is absolutely giving those communities a say in what these services look like. But it's also kind of trust between the statutory partners, between statutory bodies and the voluntary sector. I think one thing that this kind of comes back to, and it touches on a lot of what we've been saying, potentially where Big Society went wrong, at least in kind of its execution, was seeing civil society as a replacement, not as a complementary force to statutory services. So if I think about our work responding to emergencies, there's absolutely no way we would want the Red Cross to replace the police, clinicians, paramedics. They have to be there. But what we can do on the ground in that kind of delivery aspect is support people with their holistic needs, all those things that kind of blue lights don't have time for. And we can stay with those communities after an event. We can help them recover. And that gives us really important insights as well, and rapport with those communities to then use those insights and kind of improve response in the future.
Mm-hmm. And I hear you use the term strategic partner, and I hear that in these conversations quite a lot, but like, give me more meat
What
on the
does it
bone
mean?
of that, yeah.
Okay, so it means coming to us when you're shaping even priorities, like trying to understand what are the problems facing this community in this particular area, and then looking to us, and ideally when charities are at their best, they're bringing people with lived experience into those conversations as well, to then start shaping those solutions. And I think one of the reasons why the loneliness brief works so well is because us as charities as well, and there were private sector organisations, public sector representatives as well, but it was a new area that we were all working on together. Loneliness has existed forever, but in terms of trying to find those solutions together. So none of us were coming from kind of a really fixed perspective. There was no blame, there wasn't that kind of bureaucracy that comes with something that we've all tried so many times and failed at. But I think we need to put those kind of divisions and what points of separation behind us, and respect that when we come into a room, whether it's at a local level or a national level, we're going to have different perspectives. And that is how good solutions arise, because we come to an issue that is complex with the nuance that it deserves. And I think that's what I mean when I talk about the BCS being a strategic partner.
Absolutely. Now, this is a risky statement in a room like this, but civil society is also not perfect. What does civil society need to do to change, to become a better strategic, to be more strategic partnerable? Matt, do you want to start with that? And then I'll continue there.
Well, I mean, one of the things we do at Lloyds Bank Foundation is we give unrestricted funding, but we also give capacity building support as well. And capacity building support is critical. So, and that means that if you get supported by us and you want a strategy consultant, a fundraising consultant, a new CRM system, we'll be there alongside you as a charity partner to unlock that. So I think there is something here about capacity building that's really important. How do you ensure you're building resilience into the system? As an example, have you considered how you might use social financing in a different way? And walking towards that, making sure we've got the right infrastructure around you to explore that as a proposition. Because I think unless you start to think about new forms of financing on a more sustainable basis, all that happens is you get people that are reliant on grant funding for 3 years, and certainly you end up then with a cliff edge, and then someone has to find more funding after that. So we've got to break that cycle, which includes the sort of remodelling of how commissioning works as well. So there's a thing in there about how we more strategically, I think, approach that from a sector point of view, umbrella bodies and infrastructure bodies. And then I think the other thing I would add is, and sometimes it may be your cause is better achieved by merging either a service or your whole function as a charity. And we work with an organisation called the Decelerator that helps people deal with good endings in a way that gives people dignity, because we don't exist for the charity sector. We exist for the social causes that we are here to work in service towards. Last point on larger charities. I'm not a kind of small charity good, large charity bad person, not least because I've run all shapes and sizes of charities. But I think I completely agree with what Greg did. Sometimes the small, the local, is so much more powerful at reaching hyper-local communities and demographics that larger systems can't reach. So when I look at what sort of transformation of what the likes of Oxfam have tried to do to say we're a large body, but actually we're going to use some of our funding to push it down at a hyper-local level, I think that is probably some lessons there for other larger charities going forward.
And Lauren, and I wonder, Olivia, after that, if you want to come back on that point, because I know the Red Cross did a lot of learning about how to partner locally as well.
I wanted to come back to, the point of how do you get the civil society together? From both sort of government perspective, but also civil society, there's a question of how do you break silos? How do you get people really working together? we need really to keep in mind that a lot of charities, they're effectively competing for the same grants. And this is where we have an issue, which goes back as well to the fact that funding is a lot volatile. So if you start to really support charities for getting together, for sharing the space, but also sharing the strategic visions, then you start to have a much more efficient share of the funding available. And this is done actually by some of the organizations we're working with, for example in Brighton, the Old Bull Corner Community Centre, where they are sharing the space, they're managing costs by providing the space for free, but then providing certain services. They also have a very strategic approach on whose charity is able, for example, to get specific grants. And then they have a system, for example, of re-granting. And this again goes back on trust. And I think that's really important here. And it's really sort of pushing this idea of this systemic strategic thinking, which I think is very important from the local government perspective, but also from the charities perspective.
Thank you. Lydia, do you want to pick up on partnership?
Yeah, a couple of things. So, absolutely agree of the role of small charities. I don't think society could function without small charities. There is this idea that large charities aren't based in those local communities, but we are there. So, we have people, locals, working in all of our local charities. However, we are a large charity, we have kind of privileges that come with that, a lot of more security than a lot of other organisations. And a lot of our services don't just depend on having strong partnerships with statutory bodies on a local level. They actually depend on kind of building and sometimes even investing, putting money into local community groups, into smaller charities. If you take our work on kind of social prescribing link workers, you take our work supporting people who frequently attend A&E, our goal is to meet people's holistic needs as close to home as possible, and that absolutely relies on social infrastructure, local charities, local communities, networks. And where we've worked best, and a lot of this actually was with our Community Connector work, which the Co-op funded years ago, was when we created these effectively social prescribing link workers. They were working in local areas, and it was a success almost immediately because there was a huge body of local community assets to tap into. And in other places that just simply didn't exist. And so what we started to do was use some of our kind of national funding to then give pockets of money, just small bits of money to those local communities, often to the people that we were helping who were struggling with loneliness and isolation but starting to see their way out. And they would set up their own schemes, their own community groups. And those have had such a long lifeline. They've continued to exist years after kind of we stopped providing those community connector schemes. And they've supported other people, preventing people to fall into isolation and supporting kind of future, more NHS-focused social prescribing link workers. We don't do that all the time, and I absolutely think that is a key answer, and it comes back to what you were saying, that like, all of us, we're here, we're created because we've got a particular mission, we've got a cause, we're trying to alleviate X suffering. And good, strong leadership in the charity sector needs to kind of put aside our own brand sometimes and think who is best placed to meet that need. And sometimes it might be the Red Cross, or sometimes it might be a small community. And I think we all need to work in that way. And as soon as more organisations do it, everyone will be a little bit happier to kind of give space to others. But it's not always easy with tight budgets.
Gregory, is there a role MPs can play in that at a local level?
Well, I mean, clearly MPs are advocates, or should be advocates, for their local organisations, and I make it a mission, if that's the right word, to go and visit as many local organisations, local charities, and as you've said, large charities that are operating locally in my area. I think it's very easy, I think, to take these organisations as they're always going to be there, always going to do the job. And I think it's really important for us as politicians to both to give them the support, but also to understand what they're doing and what their mission is. It's kind of obvious, I think, what Cancer Research UK does, sort of name above the door. But what does the Scouts do? I mean,
They're in the room.
I mean, some people would articulate, well, it's summer for me to take my kids for some fun times, And of course it is that, but it's also so much more. And I'm not here to advocate for the Scouts or the Sea Cadets or whoever. They can do a great job of that themselves. But it's about how do we look beyond what the name is, or what it just superficially looks like it's there to do, and actually promote the wider benefits of being part of those organisations. I think there's also an element of, going back slightly to your question about what the charities or what civil society sometimes get wrong. I think often, and I was a local council for 17 years before I was my sins, for 17 years before I became a member of Parliament, and therefore I had quite a lot of interaction at the sort of commissioning, payment side for that. And sometimes I think charities were very good at asking for money and demonstrating why they as an organisation needed the money, but not so much as to who benefits and why. And it was very much, we didn't make that next step. And the defences were put up by local authorities, if we're talking about health and social care stuff, because it's ex-charity they're coming in, they're going to want money. And actually, going back to your question, our role as elected politicians, whether members of Parliament or local councillors, is to break that division down and say, actually, yes, it is about the money, of course, but being those advocates that it's not just about the money, it's about why are these organisations a social good in themselves.
I'm already in these answers hearing quite a lot of solutions around how money flows, how the incentives flow through the system, the kind of behaviours of the centre in acting as more platforms for organisations to work together rather than directors of how things happen. But one of the things we're looking at in this project is kind of the political narrative around this. And in a context where people are feeling very frustrated and distrusting, but actually the most trusted kind of people and places are where you live and in your neighbourhood and with local people. Is there more of a political narrative to put around the role of civil society in national renewal? I know Matt's going to say yes because he's funded us to do work on this, but I wonder, Gregory, if you can pick up on that point. Like, what's the role of is there a political narrative in this that answers some of that frustration in the country?
Well, I think if there isn't, there needs to be, certainly. I think superficially, the rhetoric, whenever you talk to politicians, is of course charity is excellent, we support it. But what does that actually mean when you're talking about policy making, when you're talking about funding, when you're talking about how we're going to remake the state for the betterment of society? And in some ways, the big society as a narrative, let's put the sort of implementation aside, but as a narrative, did some of that, at least it was in the consciousness, at least I felt at the time there was at least an understanding, even if it didn't necessarily get to the point we wanted to. I don't think necessarily there is at the moment. I think people are looking at all sorts of really, really terrible and difficult problems that we're facing both in this country and across the globe, and are not necessarily looking at the civil society to help or solve those problems, apart from perhaps in the sort of firefighting, oh my goodness, we've got problem X, can the Red Cross help, or whatever. So I don't think there is that narrative, and I think all political parties need to really find a way of inserting that back into their thinking.
Do you want to pick that up?
Yeah, it's just, you asked earlier on what you wanted to hear a bit more about why the loneliness works so well, and I think I've spoken about some of the aspects, that shared ambition, it being a new policy area, the trust, etc. But absolutely critical was we had number 10's backing.